All right, well, this afternoon, my job is to bring all the things we talked about this morning by way of the foundation of what a biblical worldview is, the conflict between a biblical Christian worldview and other worldviews that are counterfeits competing for our attention, and to try to show how that actually makes a difference in our lives while we are fighting against the insulin coma that comes from eating lots of ham. So I know I have my work cut out for me, but I want you to be thinking as we go through this session about what are the areas of my life where the actual things that I do every day as a teacher or as somebody who works in a business or somebody who works for the government or whatever it happens to be, what are the things that I can do every day that will show to other people that the truth really does change everything. And to begin the discussion, I want to go all the way back to ancient Greece. A lot of people know there were philosophers in different cultures at different points in time, but it really was the Greeks who became the famous philosophers. And I'll tell you why they became famous for it, because they began to dialogue with each other about things that relate to ultimate reality. Not just whether this or that small point of doctrine is true, but what about what's ultimately real and how do we know? And they had a problem. Their problem was this. They all began with the assumption that the universe is eternal. When something is eternal, it never came into existence. So if the universe never came into existence, I mean, can you ever say 1, 2, 3, go if there's no such thing as a zero? You see that? If the universe is eternal, then it never came into existence. If it never came into existence, why do we have this persistent feeling that it does in fact exist and that it's somehow meaningful? This is what the ancient Greek philosophers were ultimately debating about. And they came to a lot of different conclusions, but they sort of oriented their discussions around one key word in the Greek language that most people don't think about. Unless they've been in church, they probably have heard this word, but it's the Greek word logos. Logos, L-O-G-O-S, logos. That's what they were asking. What's the logos? And what they meant by that is, what's the connecting point between what is ultimately real and what we can know? And some of them said, well, if the universe is eternal, we can't know that it exists, but we can make logical arguments that sensibly explain the world around us. So they developed syllogisms. All men are mortal, premise A. Premise B, Socrates is a man, therefore premise C, Socrates is immortal. Or whatever it happens to be, we can do enough of those and we will eventually be able to explain enough of the world to persuade ourselves that this actually exists. Other people, Pythagoras, said we can model the known physical universe. And because we can model it using geometrical theorem, then we can understand the world around us. Other people said, no, it's actually speech, because it's not just the way we think, it's the way we talk. Because when we talk, we actually bring structure to our thoughts. And by bringing structure to our thoughts and communicating with other people, then we actually bring about a speech-based structure of reality. But the term they were using was always the same. It was the logos. And some people thought it's mind, some people thought it's speech, some people thought it's logical formulae or whatever. And then along comes the Apostle John. When people ask me if I were to just read one book in the New Testament, which one should I read? And I tell them you should read the Gospel of John. Because sometimes it's helpful to have a 30,000-foot view of what all of Scripture and ultimately all of reality is about, and that's what John gives us. Here's what's fascinating. John changed the world of philosophy. And he did it starting in John chapter 1, which goes like this. In the beginning was the Logos, the Word. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. He was with God in the beginning. All things were created through him, and apart from him, not one thing was created that was created. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. That light shines in the darkness, and yet the darkness did not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was created through him, and yet the world did not recognize him. He came to his own, and his own people did not receive him. But to all who did receive him, he gave them the right to be children of God, to those who believe on his name, who were born not of natural descent or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God. The Logos became flesh and dwelt among us, and we observed his glory, the glory as the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. The truth exists, and it's not just a logical proposition. It's not just a mathematical formula. The truth is a person. It's Jesus. And John bases his entire gospel on this. He says, in fact, when you get a little bit further into John 8:32, Jesus said, "If you abide in my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." You will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. To nerd out for just a second on this, that word truth, aletheia, means reality. Jesus is not saying, if you follow my teachings, you will know your truth. He is not saying, if you follow my teachings, you're going to feel better about yourself. He's not saying, if you follow my teachings, you're going to be an easier person to be around. He's saying, if you follow my teachings, reality itself opens up for you. Now, we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow in church, and it might, I don't know, I've been praying about this. I recognize that some of the things we talk about kind of can rub us the wrong way. Right? Because we have different thoughts on this or different views. We're coming at it from different perspectives. But the real focal point that I want to try to get to is we're better off living in reality, even if reality is difficult, than we are pretending that something is real that is not. Now, if you talk to a psychologist, one of my best friends is a therapist, counseling psychologist. It's very helpful to have a friend who's a hunting buddy and also is a psychologist. It works great. But he's explained to me that, look, in the field of psychology, if someone is experiencing a mental illness, the number one thing they must do to get well is to grapple with reality as it actually exists. Without that, there is no healing. In the field of sociology, people talk about a similar thing, that if you don't have a shared understanding of reality, you can't create a society. And I wonder if the same thing is true about all of reality, that we need to know what Jesus is talking about here, reality itself, in order to make sense of the world around us. So, and I know some of the questions that you've been sending in are some really philosophical ones as we go. We'll get as much time as we can to grapple with these, but hopefully some of the things that I talk about here will bring some clarity. But as I just want to reemphasize this before I get into what the key points will be for this session. Truth exists, and it is more than a set of logical propositions or a mathematical formula. It is a person. It is Jesus. So Jesus is the truth. So if truth is true but also personal at the same time, that changes the way we communicate about it. Because it isn't just person-centered in the sense that we don't really care what is true, like you do you and I'll do me. But at the same time, if we proclaim a factual knowledge, but we do it in a way that doesn't relate to persons, then it comes across wrong as well. On the one hand, you have arrogance. I'm right, you're wrong, deal with it. On the other hand, you have apathy. What's up, man? Whatever you want to believe is cool with me, you know? And neither one of those can really create a good society, but when you put the two together, things really happen. And that's what I want to demonstrate by talking about 4 areas where that one statement, Jesus is the truth, changed everything. I'm going to begin with something that we think a lot about in the West. And what I mean by the West is nations that came out of a European tradition, out of a UK, British tradition. But we think about issues like human dignity. Every person has dignity. Dignity is not something I give to a person, it's something that they have. I acknowledge that they have it. But the idea that every human being has dignity, where did that actually come from? A lot of people just say, well, it doesn't really matter where it came from, we just acknowledge that it's true. And I understand, you know, the UN Commission on Human Rights, the opening part of the charter says, because the assigned nations agree, therefore this is what is true. It is not whether the nations agree with it. Because if it were, any of those nations that decide to now disagree with it contradict the central thesis. If all of the nations decide we now disagree with this, does the opposite then become true? My students grapple with this all of the time. I remember the first time I asked a group of students, how do we know that Adolf Hitler was wrong? And the answer, believe it or not, from every young adult group that I've talked to before they really have a chance to process this, the answer is this: we know he was wrong because he lost. Because he lost. So if he had won, then he would have been right? Yes, that is their answer. That is their answer. They haven't grappled with the fact that there is a law of nature, a law of humanity. The rights of man, as John Locke talked about them, are rooted in something that is transcendent. And because of that, they can only think in terms of winning and losing. Well, if that is the case, if it is to our benefit to win by denying the dignity of someone else, then why should we not deny it? Every global conflict you can think of started on this basis. Adolf Hitler trained the German people to think of Jews as parasites. And we know what a parasite is. It's something that can't sustain itself. It can only sustain by attaching itself to you and stealing nutrients from your body. The only way to deal with it is to eradicate it. And that's how he taught people to think about Jewish people. We know in Rwanda, the conflict in the 1990s between the Tutsis and the Hutu leaders taught their people to think of Tutsis as cockroaches. They literally, on the appointed day, went into the homes and with machetes slaughtered people they had been next to in the worship service at church the week before, because they denied the humanity of those people. Now, this is a controversial thing to say in Canada as well as in the United States. But I want you to think uncomfortably for just a moment about the terms that are used to describe the unborn. Fetus, clump of cells, product of conception. It does seem in a way that we've become far too comfortable allowing our language to be used in a way that proscribes certain people as out of the bounds of being considered as having dignity. But what that means, we can only understand that if we understand that people do have dignity somehow. Where did we get that idea? I will tell you, it did not come from a secular worldview. Marvin Minsky is the artificial intelligence pioneer, and he regularly referred to humans as, quote, meat machines. Meat machines. I remember the first time we were developing an app, a programmer and I were developing an app. We went out to Apple in California, and we talked to a bunch of different people at all different levels in the company about different things. And it was the first time I'd ever heard this before, but I've heard it subsequently many times. They talked about three things at Apple. They talked about hardware, your actual phone. They talked about software, the apps that your phone runs. And then they talked about wetware. After about the third or fourth conversation, I said, excuse me, hardware I understand, software I understand, wetware, what is wetware? And they said, the end user. I said, wow. So basically, I'm just a bag of meat that buys things. That was their perspective on how humanity operates. A biblical view might actually be closer to this, and I want to quote a source for you, someone you may be familiar with. His name is Dr. Seuss. A person is a person, no matter how small. A person is a person, no matter how small. Where did that idea come from? Well, it came from Genesis. Genesis 2:7, God breathed life into the man and he became a nephesh, a living soul. What is that idea of a soul? Where does that idea come from? Well, a soul is what the soul is what it is like to be you. So what is the evidence for a soul? And there's an extraordinary amount of developing evidence right now because scholars for the first time have realized they can explain more about the relationship between the mind and the brain if they acknowledge the validity of millennia of thinking about the soul. And more research is coming out on this at the present time. But some of the basic things that people are recognizing are that we know that we exist. I know that I exist. And I know that I exist independent from you. So I assume by induction that your existence means something to you that's similar to what my existence means to me. I also know that my existence is continuous, that I remain the same person even though throughout my life there are many changes. Biology teachers will tell you every 7 years, all of the cells in the human body have died and been replaced by new cells. That's pretty cool, right? Every 7 years, you are a brand new person. You're a brand new person. But if an RCMP comes to your door and says, you have unpaid traffic tickets. Really? When were they from? 7 years ago. Oh, officer, that wasn't me. You can't say that. Because they'll say, no, I'm pretty sure it was you. You can have all the cells die and be replaced that you want, but you persist. Your existence is continuous. I also know that I have mental states that are different from my physical states. I also know that my mental states are not predictable just by looking at brain states. You can tell me what part of my brain is active, but you can't tell me what I'm thinking about. There's also an increasing body of evidence, and it's largely led by Christians at this time, which is fascinating to me, people like Gary Habermas and John Burke, that the existence of the soul continues after human death, and we know this because people have near-death experiences where they actually depart from their body is clinically dead, somehow they are brought back, and they're able to describe what was happening to them during that time. That can only happen if there is somehow a difference between the mental state and the physical state. You see that? All of that those are tantalizing indicators that the soul is something real. Now, remember, I brought up this guy a little bit earlier, Luke Ferry, the author of The Brief History of Thought. He said it's to Christianity that Western civilization owes its entire democratic inheritance. I wanted to tell you a story related to this that I didn't have time for in the last session. But people wonder, where did Christianity finally get to the place where it influenced all of society, that all human beings have dignity? And it happened, according to the historian and sociologist Rodney Stark, in a very strange way. It happened in ancient Rome. Because Rome, believing that people only have rights if they are majority culture property owning males, began to be disinclined to give birth or to provide sustenance to females. There's actually a letter where a woman writes to her husband in the military and says, "Hey, congratulations, you're going to be a dad." And he writes back very matter-of-factly, "That is awesome. I'm so proud of you. If it's a boy, keep it. If it's a girl, throw it away." Like, that was the common way of thinking. Why would you have a girl? A girl can never be a male. A girl can never be a majority culture property owner. Why would we ever want to have girls? So after a period of time, this began to pick up social momentum. People would have a little girl, they would just throw the baby out. Christianity was growing in Rome at that time. The Christians, believing that all human beings, even little baby girls who are unwanted, have dignity, began to go through the streets, and when they found the little baby girls, they would pick them up, take them home, and raise them as their own. It was an early form of adoption. After a while, you can imagine these young men growing up in Rome looked around, they wanted to find a girl, and there were no girls. Where are all the girls? And the answer was, they're in church. Because you guys threw them out in the street, they picked them up and raised them. So they would go to church, say, "I really like you, will you marry me?" Only if you become a Christian first. The historian and sociologist Rodney Stark, who must have had quite a sense of humor, actually coined a term for this: secondary conversion. You're like, yeah, I can understand that. But he says it was the secondary conversion of the pro-life instinct of Christians in Rome. They weren't sophisticated about this. They just knew that every baby girl also bears God's image, and she should not be thrown away. So they acted on instinct, picked up the girls, brought them home. That led to Christian families, and that ultimately led to the Christianization of Rome. It is not a narrative that you will hear in your school. What you'll hear in the school is a power-based, victim perpetrator mindset that says that, well, Constantine realized he could secure his power if he mandated Christianity. But the truth is far more interesting. It's far more interesting. It's just a simple thing. But we would not have a concept of human dignity were it not for this biblical way of thinking that was played out in other areas of life. Does that make sense? All right, let me do number 2, science. Science. Is science based on the idea of the rejection of biblical truth? Because people often say, trust the science. Science tells the truth, and religion doesn't. Religion's based on personal opinion. Science is based on the facts. In fact, Stephen Hawking, who was a brilliant scientist, it's quite an incredible story. If you don't know of it, he was a brilliant physicist, had a neuromuscular disorder that disabled his body to the point that he could only communicate by moving his eye. By moving his eye, however, he could focus through a reticle on different words and then select those words and put them into a word processor, which in a kind of robotic voice would say what he is thinking. When he gained that ability, people realized he was doing in his head calculations about black holes in space. So it's really, truly an incredible story of human dignity in a way. But he said this about the battle of religion and science. He said there is a fundamental difference between religion, which is based on authority, and science, which is based on observation and reason. Science will win because it works. Notice how he's not just saying science and religion are different. He's saying they are different ways of thinking about the same thing. One is wrong and one is right. That's an indication of a false worldview. And I think it would be fair to say that Stephen Hawking was a brilliant physicist, but a terrible philosopher. So how do we grapple with this from a biblical view? You probably have read in Scripture some of the Psalms. These are wonderful Psalms just about nature. That the universe is not a cold, dark vacuum, that it actually is alive and full of meaning. You've heard the old term, the music of the spheres. It was common among early Christian thinkers to think about the universe as music. And it's fascinating because when you look at, I remember reading one of the C.S. Lewis books in Chronicles of Narnia about the creation of the world, about the universe was sung into existence through the Creator. There's been, and this is very controversial research in physics right now because it's highly theoretical, but there's even the development of an idea called string theory in the last 20 years or so, where people have begun to say, that the universe seems to be built on these strings like a giant dulcimer. And these strings actually have a musical aspect to them. It's fascinating to think about. But the psalmist said this way back when: the heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Day to day pours out speech, and night to night reveals knowledge. There is no speech, nor are there words whose voice is not heard. Early scientists picked up on this, and I'll tell you some stories. Here's one guy. His name is Robert Grosseteste. Robert Grosseteste was a professor at Oxford University. Fascinating story. Started as a monastery to train monks, and then moved into education as it developed a library and many, many other areas. But Robert Grosseteste, I know he doesn't look like a scientist from this. He looks like he's a pope or something, but he was a scientist who really focused on the nature of light. And light is a creative force. This led to all sorts of innovations in science, but also in architecture. I think the name is hilarious, actually, because gross in German means large or fat. And Tessa is related to the Romance language word for head. Are you tracking this? There literally was a Professor Fathead. He taught science at Oxford University. You probably have never heard of this guy before, but I bet you have heard of Roger Bacon, who was the guy whose work laid the groundwork for the development of the scientific method. Grosseteste did all of his work as a Christian. In fact, his entire discourse on light, which you can read on the internet today, focuses on God creating the universe through light. When God said, "Let there be light," he actually took that and said, that's not just a statement of theology, that's a scientific fact. And he explained it all from his biblical worldview. Let me give you another example of Nicholas Copernicus. He said, now Copernicus is a fascinating case because this guy, he figured out that the planets orbit around the sun, the heliocentric system. How he figured it out is fascinating to me. He was doing a Bible study with some friends, and he wanted to run some astronomical calculations to show what the heavens looked like on the day that Jesus rose from the dead. And he started doing the calculations and realized these are not working. They're not working. If the Earth is at the center of the solar system, they don't work. If we take the Earth and we say that the sun is the center of the solar system, the calculations work out to a 92% accuracy. Why didn't he get to 100%? Because he did make the assumption that the orbits were circular. There was another guy who came along and said, what if the orbits are elliptical? Another Christian named Johannes Kepler, and he figured out that other 8%. Now, these guys were doing a lot of heavy math, but they wouldn't rest. 92%, that's pretty good. If you had an investment that had a 92% chance of getting a good return, you probably would just quit worrying about the other 8%. But they're like, no, it's the other 8% that's going to change the world. And so they did all of that work. But Copernicus said this: to know the mighty works of God, to comprehend his wisdom and majesty and power, to appreciate in degree the wonderful workings of his laws, surely all this must be a pleasing and acceptable mode of what? Of worship to the Most High. Raise your hand if you ever took a science class. Raise your hand. I'm not going to ask for grades. I just want to know if you took it. Did it ever occur to you in your science class that you were engaged in worship? You were. Because everything is worship. Math class is worship. Language class is worship. History class when you're learning the 5 causes of the Industrial Revolution. Worship. It's all worship. You see, from God's perspective, there's nothing outside of his charge. And everything benefits us. If you're feeling anxious, the number one thing you can do is get physical exercise. Did you realize that? That's verified in the literature. Your phys ed class means something. What about the learning of all those facts? Turns out the number one way to grow your creativity is by learning facts. What about math class? Math class and music class, interestingly enough, both of these have a very similar effect on the brain. Those are 2 of the most significant ways for you to learn problem-solving skills. Everything in our world has been designed by God to enable us to bear his image. Here's another scientist that I really appreciate. I realized when I put the slide up here that I did not put, like, she's born in 1930, so you're like, yeah, she's a very old lady. She passed away 3 weeks ago. Gladys West, one of my favorite scientists of all time. She did by hand all of the mathematical calculations that led to the development of GPS. Do you understand how important that is? None of you would be here without GPS. You would be somewhere, but you never would have found your way to Main Street Church. And our pilot on the poor airplane yesterday never would have found his way to Vancouver, Canada, if it had not been for GPS. We have a lot to thank this lady for. She was asked, what do you think about the battle between science and religion? And she said, I don't even remember a time where Jesus and his church were not part of my life. I love that. But it doesn't prove something if it's just a handful of examples here or there. It might be good to sort of look at the bigger picture. Are science and faith at odds? Here's what's fascinating. Rodney Stark, the historian sociologist I mentioned earlier, went through, and it's mind-numbing in the detail, but he cataloged all of the inventions and discoveries that constitute modern science. Then he looked at who the inventors and discoverers were, and came up with a list of 52 individuals whose inventions and discoveries are responsible for the development of modern science. Of those 52 founders of modern science, only one was an atheist. Only one. Only one. One was a little bit more new spiritualist, but 50 were believing Christians. Now somebody might say, well, it's just because everybody had to be a Christian at that time. That was the socially acceptable thing to do. But that's not true. When you look at their writings, for example, Robert Boyle, the father of modern chemistry, actually wrote a book called Christian Virtuoso, How to Worship God by Being a Natural Philosopher. That was his term for scientist. How to worship God by being a scientist. He understood that there are things that are true that we know to be true because of Scripture that are the basis of science, even if people don't acknowledge Scripture as the foundation. For example, that the world exists. The ancient Greeks couldn't really do science because they couldn't acknowledge that the world actually exists. They could not acknowledge that the world has a consistency to it. If you did an experiment at time A and an experiment at time B, you don't even know if you're experimenting in the same world. So what would be the point? The world is good, but the world is not God. It is good, we have reverence for it, but we don't worship it. We worship the one who created it. All of these things became the basis of science. And it wasn't just true back then, it's even true now. Of those who have ever won the Nobel Prize in Science, 2/3 listed Christian as their religious affiliation. 2/3. Interestingly, 20% listed Jewish as their affiliation, which I find fascinating, maybe even more fascinating, because the total number of Jewish people in the entire world is 12 million. I mean, if you just look at the difference between an Islamic worldview and a Christian worldview, there are 120 Muslims in the world for every Jew that there is in the world. Yet this tiny percentage of people are responsible for 20% of the Nobel Prizes in science. If you add those two together and call it a Judeo-Christian worldview, it accounts for virtually all, 86% of the Nobel Prizes in science. How is it possible that people of that worldview, as opposed to any other, are the ones who did the development of it? And when you look back in history, you realize it's because they recognize that Jesus is the truth is not just a theological statement, it's an actual statement about reality itself. You want more? Yeah. Let's do education. Any teachers in the room? Teachers? All right, thank you for raising your hand. God bless you. We put an awful lot on you. We send you kids who we don't have any idea what to do with. And we expect you to do something with it. And it's a very hard job. If you have teachers, whether they teach at a public school, Christian school, homeschool moms, homeschool dads, we need to be in much prayer for them because they are in many ways the ones who are prophetically preparing the rising generation for what God wants to do. But in the field of education, the innovations that came about did not come about because of secularists. In fact, the secular worldview began to diminish the significance and the power of education. I think of a guy like Melville Herskovitz. He actually was a professor at Northwestern University near Chicago in Evanston, Illinois. He said, even the facts of the physical world are discerned through the inculturative screen, so that the perception of time, distance, weight, size, and other realities, he scare quotes, is mediated by the conventions of any group. In other words, what you believe or feel is what is actually true. And I have some suggestions. If you're a pilot and you think that the distance between Chilliwack, BC and Tokyo, Japan is only 10 miles, can I at least recommend that you take 4,000 miles worth of fuel, just in case? You see, the idea behind this way of thinking, it diminishes education. In the States, we've begun to see people even politicize it. They say there's actually a teacher's guide in the state of Oregon that says, if you teach children in math that there is a correct answer, that is racist. Yes. If you tell children they have to show their work, that is capitalist and imperialist. I mean, it's quite open that this is what they say. They're trying to figure out how to take politics and even take it into the field of mathematics. So where does a biblical worldview come down on this? I think the basis of education, a lot of Christians and Jews who have studied this would agree, would be going back to Deuteronomy chapter 6. And there are a couple of things I think are interesting to point out here, but I'll just go ahead and, sorry, I keep getting in your way here. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lie down, and when you rise, which is a poetic way of saying what? All the time. You do it all the time. This is interesting as well. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. That word might in Hebrew is me'odka. Remember the word me'od that we looked at earlier? Very. This literally means love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your very. And you would say from a literal standpoint that doesn't make any sense, but we all know it does make sense. Because what you actually love with your energy, with who you are, with the totality of your being is the stuff that you really love. You show me your loves, I will show you your life. You see, that idea comes from the book of Deuteronomy. And the way it got transmitted to the world, once again, is just as crazy as you can imagine. Let me just give you one story. I'll give you two. Let me do this one. Columbanus, he was a monk. He lived in Ireland. Somehow, even though he was early in the 500s, somehow he got a hold of the Gospels of Jesus. And he read in the book of Matthew, "Go into all the world and make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you and baptizing them And so he went to his brother monks and said, I need to go into all the world. And they said, Brother Columbanus, we live on an island. He said, then I need a boat. Let's make a boat. How do we make a boat? I don't know, animal skins. So they made a boat out of animal skins. They asked him, what would you like to do for navigation? You want a rudder? You want some oars? A sail? He said, no, none of that. Just launch me out. Why? Because then I will go wherever God wants me to go. Can you imagine that launch party? Bye. I think you're still going to be floating off in the middle of the ocean. Brother, we love you. Off he went. He landed in Britain. He came ashore. He gathered everybody around, learned to communicate with them, and said, okay, here's the deal. There's this guy named Jesus. He came. He told me to come here and teach you to observe all of his teachings and to baptize you. So you all have to become Christians. And they're like, okay. And then he said, let's build ourselves a building here, because I'm going to get some books and stuff. I'm going to teach you guys to read, and we're going to put all the books in there. And then some of you who really want to study this, you can come and live there and study these books all the time. So some of them wanted to do that. It became a monastery. The monastery became a library. The library became a university. And then Columbanus got in his boat again. You would think that's a once-in-a-lifetime adventure. No. He got in his boat again, floated away, and he landed in France. Same thing, came aboard and said, all right, gather around, you people. Here's what's going on. And they came to Christ. They built a monastery, which turned into a library, which became a university. How do we know this? Because he did it 13 times. 13 times throughout his life. The others weren't by water. He went through Switzerland and Italy, so maybe the water thing got a little old after a while, but he just went up, down through Italy, and many of these monasteries still exist today. Some became universities. I don't know if you're aware of this, but when you think about the top 15 universities in the entire world, all 15 of them were started by Christians in the world today. They're not really very Christian now, but they were started by Christians. Why? Because they understood that in order to obey God, you have to love him with all of your heart and your soul and all of your might. And that everything is education. By the way, you know the difference between the word education and the word schooling. Education, eduke, means to lead out of. You can school someone just by keeping them in the classroom 8 hours a day. But to educate someone, you have to lead them out of ignorance. In order to lead them out of ignorance, you have to acknowledge two things. Number one, that they are ignorant of what they need to know. And number two, there is such a state as less ignorant, because we have some standard by which we are judging. If you can't acknowledge the truth, you can't educate a person. John Wycliffe is another one. He also taught at Oxford University, which had started as a monastery, not by Columbanus, but a similar story. And his thing was, look, I think I should translate the Bible into English. This was fraught with all sorts of difficulties at the time. English was not a very well-developed language, and so people were saying, well, look, if you translate the Bible into English, it's a vulgar language. That would be like adding curse words every third or fourth word. We just don't do that. In fact, we don't do it to the point where if you do, we will kill you. That's how serious we are about this. John Wycliffe's response was, Moses heard from God in his own language. It is true. You think, well, sure, Moses saw the burning bush. If the burning bush had said, learn Latin and then come back and talk to me later, it would have turned out very differently. He heard from God in his own language. The disciples heard from Jesus in their own language. And he said people today need to be able to hear from God in their own language. But he did acknowledge the English language was rude and undeveloped. So you know what he did? In order to translate the Bible into English, he developed it. He developed the English language. There are more than 1,100 English words that are recorded for the first time in the Wycliffe Bible. Words such as treasure, mystery, glory, first fruits, grasp, zealous, conscious, communication, persuasion. This one's funny to me. Wycliffe even introduced the word wordy, which is used in the book of Ecclesiastes. You see, it was Christians who said, it's important for us to come out of ignorance because there is such a thing as truth. Let me do one more. Politics. Everybody groans. Oh, we have to talk about this. Of course you're going to talk about politics. I remember a couple years ago, it was during a presidential election, I think, in the States, and I had a group of 2,000 teachers, and I put this one up here. They literally groaned. They're like, we're so tired of hearing about politics. In the States, only about 10% of people say that they don't become distressed about politics. About 5% said they really like it. Just not that many. But I want to emphasize the nature of the political structures that are common to both your country and to mine and where they came from. This is not something that would have emerged from a secular worldview. In politics, secularism tends toward postmodernism. You have people like the postmodern professor Stanley Fish, who teaches law and English at a university in New York. He was asked, well, if there's no such thing as truth, then how do you ever know what a fact is? And he said, you are entitled to your own facts if you can make your version of them stick. At least he was blunt. What's a biblical view? It's very different. If you go back to Jeremiah 29, you see that Jeremiah was writing to the people who were in exile. I don't know that exile is the right illustration for our current situation today, but it's a really important teaching. Why did he write this? Why did he write to them? Because another prophet had written to the people and said, God is going to relent very quickly on his anger that sent you into exile, so keep your bags packed. And Jeremiah wrote to them and said, that other prophet is a liar. He said, seek the welfare of the city where I've sent you into exile and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. In other words, you're going to be there for a long time. Settle in. Don't try to escape. Engage. And then he used this term welfare. In the Hebrew, that word welfare is the word shalom. Shalom. Shalom means peace, prosperity, blessings of every kind. Can you just see that in the passage? But seek the peace and the prosperity and the blessings of every kind of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its peace and prosperity and blessings of every kind, you will find your peace and prosperity and blessings of every kind. That a biblical Christian worldview is giving out, not just taking in. It is a worldview of engagement, not a worldview of escape. It is a worldview of giving, not taking. It's a worldview of building up, not depleting. Let me just illustrate this to you. This is example, from Korea. After World War II, South Korea moved strongly toward a Christian worldview. North Korea moved strongly toward communistic atheism. Now, do you think that you would have noticed a difference on the first day that the transition took place between the two? Probably not. They're speaking the same language, they're growing the same kinds of crops, they're preparing the same kinds of food, they live in the same kind of homes. Would you notice the difference after a month? Maybe a little bit. How about a year? Maybe a little bit. What about 70 years? Do you think you would notice a difference? After the founding of South Korea, 70 years after the founding of South Korea, this picture was taken from outer space. There is North Korea almost literally in the dark ages, South Korea well lit and prosperous. Ideas have consequences. Bad ideas have bad consequences. Good ideas have good consequences. Where do good consequences come from? Now, South Korea, it's interesting, there are only only a couple of nations in the entire world where people have religious freedom, who also have political freedom, who also have economic freedom, where a majority of the people say that their rights come from God. And South Korea is one of them. So it may be changing now, but you understand, there's something they grasp about the nature of political theory coming from a biblical worldview, even though only a small percentage of the people in the country are actually Christians, that we somehow need to learn from. And it goes back to a Presbyterian minister in Scotland named Samuel Rutherford. Let me tell you Samuel Rutherford's story. He wrote a book called Lex Rex. That's a pretty cool short title for a book, right? X's are always cool. And so he's got two of them in there, Lex Rex. Anybody take Latin class in school? Lex is the word for law, and Rex is the word for king or prince or ruler, the regent. So the law is the king. You say, why would that make anybody mad? Well, it is a very short title for a book. 2 words, 3 letters each. The subtitle, however, is 136 words long. And in it, you realize he's making an argument against the king. The king believes in Rex Lex. The king is the law. Whatever the king does is by definition legal. That's what the king believed. He was saying it's not true. The law is the king. The king must obey the law just like everybody else. Now, he wrote this, unfortunately, at a time where there was a lot of instability. And if you studied British history just a little bit, you know that there was a guy who overthrew the monarchy. His name was Oliver Cromwell. The king he overthrew was named Charles I. Charles I moved off to Oxford University, lived in Christ Church College. Eventually, they said, you got to come back and face trial. And they, how do you say this politely? They shortened him by a head. Then Cromwell came in for a while, then he kind of got overthrown, and a new king came in, Charles II. You can imagine that he does not want to be overthrown in the way Charles I was overthrown, so he began to strongly insist that people like Rutherford were wrong. In fact, when he heard that Rutherford had written this book, Lex Rex, the law is the king rather than the king is the law, he sent his soldiers and said, I want you to go up there to Scotland, and I want you to arrest Samuel Rutherford, and I want you to bring him back here to Parliament, and we are going to give him a fair trial and then hang him. Samuel Rutherford, rather rudely, died before the soldiers arrived. On his deathbed, he said, I have been summoned by a higher authority. When the king received this report, he was agitated. They asked, what do you want us to do? The guy is dead. And he sent back instructions, I want you to dig up his bones and burn them. That show him every time. Samuel Rutherford actually, in some of his work, actually led a little bit later to the work of another guy named John Locke. John Locke became foundational to the governmental system that we enjoy in the United States of America. It was also foundational, especially when in 1982 you had your modern Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That a lot of the references in the Charter, and go back and read it, I encourage you to read it. A lot of those references in the Charter go back to the actual thinking of John Locke, based on the thinking of Samuel Rutherford as a pastor writing that the king cannot do whatever he wants to do. So we see this in the States in the Declaration of Independence, which says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is to us significant, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Who gives you your rights? The Creator gives you your rights. The government, at best, can secure the rights that are already yours from God. That was a Samuel Rutherford innovation right there. Now, I encourage you to go back and reread the 1982 Charter. I want you to read the preamble of it. In fact, you can, tonight when you go home, just look it up. Because it very clearly states that the charter on which Canada is based is not a secular charter. It is based on a biblical Lockean, Rutherfordian understanding of God as the supreme creator. Still in there. Still in there. Now, I know all the different things that happen along the way and what the court will or will not do, but it is there. So it's worth understanding that these innovations that have literally changed the course of history for billions of people around the world, they continue. We could do economics. We live in a fascinating time. Do you realize that for the first time in the history of the world, more than half the people in the world now live at a middle-class level or higher? That all happened within the last couple of hundred years. Why? Because of private property and free market innovation based on biblical principles of property and stewardship from the Old Testament. And you can go right on down the line and see this in so many different areas. All right, make sense? So that's what the book, Truth Changes Everything, is about. It's just basically lots and lots of stories. I wrote it because I thought it was the last book I was ever going to write because I had cancer. I thought, if I could only write one more thing, what would I write? And that's the message I wanted to give, that Jesus is the truth, and that reality changes everything. Now, God be praised, I'm 5 years out from that cancer journey. Regardless of what the future holds, I want to continue to communicate the truth. And I would say, and if you've been through difficult circumstances, you know, it kind of releases you in a way. You're like, man, things can't possibly get any worse. So miserable. But now I'm actually kind of free. I remember doing an interview with a hostile media personality. And the whole time, they're being a real snot, I was thinking, I just survived cancer. I am not afraid of you. It gives you this freedom. Somehow God uses even the difficulties in our lives to bring us to the place where we can better represent his truth. So, Sean, I don't know if I talked all the way through our Q&A time or if we have a couple of minutes, maybe a couple. We got one more session to do after this, and it's going to be the real practical steps on what actually specifically to do that brings together truth and relationship in a true but kind way. I love your worship band here, by the way.
They're great, aren't they?
They're so great. I was sitting over here, and I'm like, man, I'm hearing all these edge licks from the guitar.
Yeah.
Like, this is like U2. But where's it coming from? And Paul was standing right over here, like he was out of sight. So to me, it was just magic. It's like magic is happening right now. I hear this amazing guitar, but I just met Paul a little bit ago. It's like something, can't be magic. There had to be a guy doing that.
Sometimes
had to be a guy who's a U2 fan too, right?
We're waiting for him to smash it one time. Yeah, so he won't do it. He won't do it. He's gonna... Good. A couple of things. What political issues do you think Canadian Christians generally should prioritize in engaging? Or maybe Christians in general, maybe not even Canadians, just Christians in general. Yeah,
we can talk about Christians in general. We can talk about Canadians. I know you guys love it when Americans comment on your system. No, look, and I can only give my opinion on this. I think an issue that you have to confront, that we have to confront in the States, is we have not been able to have a really true, conclusive, successful set of court opinions that distinguish what people's actual rights to freedom of expression are up against the measures that have been taken to try to protect vulnerable people. So the human rights commissions end up creating sort of a parallel set of laws. And we're trying in the States to figure this out. You guys are trying to figure this out as well. It's super confusing. I do think that is something that is worth focusing on. But this answer might surprise you because clearly, you can tell from my presentation that I'm pro-life on the abortion issue. I think economic freedom is going to be increasingly significant. You cannot have a nation where people fall behind in their income levels or their ability to innovate and have the freedom to do it without too many constraints that would ultimately be successful in the long term. And so I'm often thinking in terms of, well, how does the power of government get used to reward or spur economic activity as opposed to constrain it? This all has to do with levels of taxation, levels of regulation. They're all different kinds of things. And some of it's really boring stuff, I have to be honest with you. This field of administrative law can be really boring, but nothing happens without it. And I wonder if Christians maybe ought to take another look at how to get involved and find ways to bring prosperity. If we really believe that not only the material world exists, that ideas mean something, that innovation means something, that inspiration means something, that information means something, then we should be innovators.
That's good. What are we currently taking for granted that came directly from Christian belief?
I think the human dignity issue is clearly it. So here's the thing, and I don't know how you all debate or think about these kinds of things, but there are a lot of people who believe, well, look, we don't need to protect the rights of Christians because there are a lot of Christians and they seem to be doing fine. They're not fighting for their survival like these other groups. So if we have to sacrifice religious freedoms to bring additional what are called positive rights, rights that the government puts forward and emphasizes, as opposed to negative rights, which is the government not prohibiting freedoms. That's people's view. So we can sort of throw religious people under the bus if we think by doing so we can better serve marginalized populations. It's something that comes out of a secular worldview, in my opinion. It's something that comes out of this oppressed mindset that emerges from sort of a combination of secularism and Marxism. And anyway, it's tricky, but you understand that there are decisions that are being handed down in your country and in mine regularly where this is a very serious tension. And I think a lot of Christians they're afraid to get involved, and you can understand why. Because if you get involved, are you saying that you don't want to share some of your rights with marginalized populations? Well, that's not Christian, right? That's rude. But if you start with the idea that there isn't really scarcity in that respect, that there's plenty to go around for everyone if we stay focused on lifting up everything, then we have a very different perspective than what often takes place for political discourse.
So what would you say to Christians in terms of, okay, you spoke a little bit there, but how do you intentionally get involved then? And what's the cost? Because there may be a cost to that. And so how would you equip or encourage people even in this room to get involved in that cause of being a Christian in the secular world that is going to push back against even this thinking you're talking about?
In the race of life, when it comes to being a citizen, the starting gun is your vote. If you're not preparing yourself to be a good voter, then it's going to be hard to recommend anything else. Being a good voter does not mean that you see yourself as making a cynical choice between the lesser of two evils. Rather, I teach my students to think of it as, I'm using my vote to lessen evil. That I'm not going to find a perfect candidate in a fallen world, but I can find someone who, given a long cast of, say, 50 or 75 years, moves us closer in the right direction than the wrong one. So I'm going to use my vote in that way. You would be amazed at how your elected officials, and I think everybody, from your, provincial leaders, all the way to the riding, your school boards, you might be surprised how amenable they are to rational discussion. Because they often get yelled at. They get letters like, I hate you and I hope that you get cancer and die and stuff like that. And so they're used to getting a lot of nastiness. What they're not used to is somebody saying, can I take you out to coffee and just have, a friendly but serious discussion about some key issue that I'm concerned about, that I just feel like you should hear from somebody who has my viewpoint. And you might be surprised. So that is another thing that you can do. There are opportunities to get involved. Again, political parties operate very differently here than in my country. There are a lot of people in the world of political science who say that a system like yours is actually more amenable to change than ours. Because you can actually start things up, and, if you can get 10% of the people in Parliament, you can do quite a bit. Because they can't form coalitions without you, right? And so I'm watching some of this in Israel. Israel's fascinating because in the United States, we have 2 major political parties and 4 or 5 minor ones. They never get a vote. In Israel, what was my last count? 55 political parties for 9 million people. 9 million people, they have 55 political parties, and 15 of them have seats in Parliament. So be thankful that ours is not quite that complicated. But those are some ways to get involved. I think you can write things. There's still opportunities to write out your thoughts or to elevate the thoughts of other people you think are important. But the way political movements are formed really is by person to person persuasion. And it's very much a discipleship kind of model. Ask yourself, why is it that Jesus trained 12 men instead of 12,000?
And then bring in 1 Peter 3:15 to that.
That's a good verse. I would have a conference on that or everything, yeah.
Well, because the thing is, we can step into that with, with attitude or with angst, and can lose our message. And so, Peter tells, do with gentleness and respect. What does that look like practically?
Well, gentleness and respect, and you look at the overall cast of what the Apostle Paul taught. He explained Paul explained what Peter was talking about there. He explained it in 2 Timothy chapter 2, and it's quite lengthy. I can give you the whole thing if you want, because it's one of those passages that I wanted to commit to memory. But he says, reject foolish and ignorant disputes, because you know that they produce quarrels. The Lord's servant must not quarrel, but must be gentle to everyone, able to teach and patient, instructing his opponents with gentleness. Perhaps God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth. Then they may escape the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. It is several things you can draw from it, but one is, it is hard for people to let go of what they believe if the person who's asking them to do so is rude. Because when you get angry, you're for sure that you're right? And you have to calm down a little bit and think, man, I blew that. So you have to give people room to back out of a bad belief. And the way you do that is by giving them that respectful, gentle, and still instruction, but it's respectful and gentle. And your hope is that by the way you interact, that perhaps God will grant them repentance, and that repentance could lead them to the knowledge of the truth, and that would enable them to be free from the snare of the devil. It's a whole different way of thinking about people. So even people who are my enemies, they're people who don't like what I teach. They don't like what I represent. They don't like what we do at Summit Ministries. I mean, we're pretty chill about things, but still, we're firm in what we teach and what we believe. And there's some people who really don't like it. We don't see them as an enemy to be opposed. We see them as people who have been taken captive. So I don't go to them and say, poor you, you've been taken captive. But if I have that in my mind, I treat somebody differently. Like if there's an animal that got snared and it's an animal that I wish hadn't been snared and I want to save it, I don't say, you dumb animal, why did you get snared? I just want to set it free. And sometimes people don't know how to be set free. I was talking to someone who worked with puppies at the Humane Society. And they said, you'd be surprised how many puppies, when somebody comes to adopt them into their forever home, cower in the back of their kennel because they're so terrified that being set free seems incredibly scary to them. They can't imagine what it would be like, but the gentleness with which you treat them is necessary for their rehabilitation.